16 hot dogs, 16 days, and 16 stories. This is 16 for 16. I'm Mary Bowers, a Korean American adoptee and competitive eater. I'm getting ready to step onto the biggest stage in all of world sports, the Nathan's Famous Hot Dog Eating Contest at Coney Island, New York. And this time, I'm bringing some friends along to share their stories. Meet Ryan, a Korean Australian adoptee, writer, and researcher. Today, we're catching up to talk about superheroes and the myths behind adoption. So I'm here with Ryan. Introduce yourself.
Oh gosh. Well, first of all, thanks. It's really cool to speak to you in this arena, I guess you call it. So I'm based in Melbourne, Australia. I was adopted to Melbourne, Australia in the mid-'80s during the peak year of Korean adoption. So I was one of 8,837 children that were sent that year alone. I am a writer and a researcher, done some research on Korean adoption.
I have a question for you. I was wondering, as far as the adoptee experience, I know for me, it's a little difficult to hide that I was adopted because my family is a different race. So that consciousness kind of came in very, very early on. And I found a lot of comfort in fairy tales and comic books because it seems like the pattern is something terrible or tragic happens to the parents. And then you have, the Batmans and the Harry Potters and the Cinderellas and the Supermans kind of emerge from the ashes. And I'm wondering, first of all, what are your superhero powers, if you're able to share? Because I know sometimes it's like you have it's like a secret. Can't tell anybody. And then what has your experience been with those narratives?
Gosh, what is my superpower is sadly the harder question out of those two to answer. What is my superpower? I would say I don't know. I would say, maybe this is a classic thing of like all superpowers are like from another perspective, a difficulty or a challenge, they can be both things. But I would say maybe curiosity. I think that's what kind of led me to do research and writing, is just a kind of like curiosity about how the world works and why people do what they do and how I ended up here and how things function. And I think that's driven a lot of my decisions, in life around like career and stuff. So I guess I would say curiosity. It's also like can be never ending, and you can always your questions lead to more questions and usually don't lead to many answers. So I think in that sense it can be a bit of a a challenge. But yeah, with regard to like my experience with those narratives, like I definitely grew up with those as well. But I'm interested in your experience. Like I don't think I ever really consciously identified with those characters whereby like they lost their parents and then they go on to like do amazing things, usually for society, even though they can be like very lonely people or whatever. Like they're actually quite like melancholic figures in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I ever like consciously identified with them. I think like as I've gotten older, I've started to like question more the sort of assumption that adopted people were once orphans. That's like one of the major concerns, that we have with regard to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the commission has like explicitly said, right, that part of what they want to look into is this sort of systematic way in which children who are not really orphans were orphans on paper. That assumption that I feel like mainstream society has, that if you were adopted, you were once an orphan, and that an orphan is always someone that is without two living parents. I think that has become a kind of a dangerous myth. And I wonder too if to a small extent, that's also because we like live amongst all these stories, like the ones that you're mentioning, and all these characters, which are so like that people can like emotionally relate to and whatnot. It just kind of perpetuates, right, a lot of the time, this myth that orphans are
So explain a little bit more. I know in my case I am very likely not an orphan, have never been an orphan, and was orphanized on paper in order to make my adoption theoretically legal, although there's some other issues where they kind of check the box of, is she an orphan? Yes, we've made her one, but in doing that there were all kinds of other things that occurred that were likely not in accordance with the law or what one would expect when taking care of children or looking out for their best interests. So in pushing up back against those narratives, I think you mentioned something really important, though. It's like people really resonate with those stories, with those myths. So why do you think that is?
I think they make for good stories. I think that like some adoption researchers have talked about how like the orphan as a figure in like literature and popular culture has been really tied to like narratives of like the state and like nation building. And it's, the orphan's usually like this figure of possibility and like limitless potential and like, look what you could make with your life, even though you come from these really sad circumstances. And so I think it's a way of building sympathy for a character, telling a story, sort of overcoming adversity, and like having this like nice kind of, you know, triumphant sort of,
for people to think about.
very much tied to like these narratives of progress that are not realistic when we're talking about human beings, right? Like they're kind of symbolic, or like they're ways that society would like to view, you know, what it means to have opportunities in life, right? And so I think what's interesting is like I wonder how many of those like superhero stories resonate with adoptees themselves, and how, you know, and to what extent like adoptees share that kind of like enthusiasm for these sorts of stories that non-adopted people might really gravitate toward. So I don't know. I think that's interesting. And of course, like the other narrative that I think is also really kind of crucial to point out, like with regard to adoption, is that, you know, like another narrative that's become really dominant is like the birth family search, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like if we're orphans and we don't have family to look for.
Yeah,
So
it's a conflict. It's conflict. Yeah.
And so in my case, I did look for Korean family. I did find Korean family. And of course, that meant that I had living parents. I've only met one of my parents, but according to my Korean mother, my Korean father was not dead. I haven't been able to find him, but yeah, I had a living Korean mother to look for and to find. So I wasn't an orphan. And then of course there's a whole host of other, you know, things related to the sorts of systemic issues that we're pointing out for the TRC, and one of them is around like Korean family providing like informed consent. And so I discovered when I met her that she did not consent, and that I was relinquished by extended family, which I think is sadly fairly common. Yeah, I think that the kind of orphanization that you spoke of is one of the most common kind of violations that this group of cases to the TRC are seeing. And the research that I've done on Korean adoption very clearly shows, as you pointed out, that the creation of orphanhood was a prerequisite for adoption. It was like administratively created. It did not reflect the reality of that family situation. And that may have been legal. That may have been the way that things were just done back then. And there's a lot also to be said, and this is getting more complicated, but there's a lot to be said of the immigration policies of receiving countries who were only supposed to receive orphans. Yes. But I know like the US, for example, explicitly said that an orphan in a legal sense is not necessarily a literal orphan. And they admitted that back in the 50s. So, you know, it's very, very complicated. But I think like it's pretty well established in the literature that, in academic literature, that orphanhood was an administrative procedure.
I think for me, what I've realized too is that the fantasy, the fairy tales are very much a part of real life adoption, because everything that we're discovering through this whole process is not even possible without selling this concept of heroes and villains. And so even though, you know, I have not yet discovered the ability to teleport or fly, even though I'm trying my hardest, I think that those narratives resonate with the public because they're so embedded into culture, into the systems that we build that have a real life practical implementation.
I call it Margaret Homans, who has written about how like going to like what you said, like adoption as a story that resonates with people runs so deep that she traces adoption back to like the very start of like kind of Western storytelling, which is the story of Oedipus, which is about adoption.
Oh, that did not go well. Oh, you were mentioning kind of this glorified reunion story where you have the sad adoptee like embraces their parents and like they live to be a happy family. That was not a happy family after. So you're fueling my nightmares now.
glad to be of service.
So what would be the counter narrative or the alternative that you would like to see kind of emerge from our story, our real life stories, and some of the remarkable abilities that each of the adoptees are bringing to the table?
That's a really good question. I think the first thing that I would probably say is that like adoptees have been telling their stories for a long time. It's just that I don't know there's the willingness to listen, first of all. Second of all, that I think we just need more realistic stories. And I think we need to question who those narratives ultimately serve. Like I said, I don't know, I'm sure some adoptees are really drawn to the figures of Batman, Superman, Harry Potter, whatever. But ultimately, I think those characters are created to tell a story to people who don't have that experience, right? Or they're like fables or they're metaphors or whatever. And I think it sounds like so naff, but like we're people with like concrete stories, which are probably quite boring, which are probably don't involve superpowers, if at all, or whatever, right? And like that's the sort of everyday existence that we live. And I think more realistic, concrete stories need to be out there to kind of counteract these sort of romanticized like narratives that I don't think ultimately serve us.
Right.
They might serve others, but not us, right? Like I feel like sometimes adoption is a story that society likes to tell itself,
Yeah.
about how, I mean, maybe in some contexts about how good of a society they are, depending on how they view adoption. But I think like what adoption means, or what being an adoptee means for an adoptee, I think that story has not been told as much. And I think to tell that story, we need individual, everyday, perhaps boring, just human stories, like nothing super exceptional. Like we don't have to be exceptional,
I don't know. You told me, okay, so here's how I read your superpower. You told me that you have your superpower is curiosity, right? But you essentially told me that you retain all of this knowledge because it keeps building and building, and then it just feels like more and more. I feel like a lot of people are like a goldfish, like you remember it for a little while and then it goes away somewhere, it like floats off into wherever it's going to live. But like you retain all of that, and
I
it's
don't
amazing.
think so.
It's amazing.
Yeah,
I think it's in theory, like the reality and the fantasy are so different. Like I always thought it would be so cool to have a secret identity. And because of this orphanization process, I am now like legally two different people. And the lived reality of that is very different than the comic books. It is not fun. It affects things like verifying who I am. Do I have a valid university degree? How do I plan my finances? How do I take care of my family and set up estate plans or wills? Like I am two separate people. Even though I feel very kind of self-reflective and somewhat actualized through this whole process, but then my outer world is like, oh no, you're not one person, you're this. It's not cool. It's really, I feel really bad for Superman versus Clark Kent, because then it becomes, I think, kind of this internal battle as well.
And I think the sad thing too, right, is like, at least I don't want to speak on behalf of you, but in your case versus someone like versus like Clark Kent Superman, right? Like this was like the battle for charting things, for administratively sorting things out, right? Like that is something that happened to you. That is like the way in which adoption as a set of institutional practices does not just end when the adoption is finalized. And I think what you just said like explains like really concretely how that's absolutely not true, and how like even on a bureaucratic, bloody annoying, boring, whatever, level, this stuff sticks around and it has impact.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that, but again, drawing it back to like that was like how adoption functioned, right? And so there's nothing that any of us did to land in that situation. It's like, this is the legacy, right, of those practices. And I would really hope that, that the TRC also views it in that way, that these aren't just things that weren't so great that happened back then, but that the impacts are incredibly varied. They range from what you're discussing through to, mental health impacts, not that they're necessarily separable. But yeah, I think the longer term stuff is really important too, to like constantly like remind.
Yeah. Like I've even noticed in terms of mental health, I've recently started assigning different emotions to each of these identities. That's something where something that's an administrative on paper thing can become an internal mental health thing. So I'm concerned, but also at the same time, the fact that I can recognize that it's happening, I think suggests that like, okay, we can address this before it's a real problem. But that is also something that was kind of created and given to me. Here you go. And so it's interesting that we can create mental health problems, physical health problems that have more significant impact. So I ended up with a stupid superpower. I would love to teleport or fly. Shape-shifting is my choice, but I ended up with this eating superpower.
Yeah.
Have you seen the hot dog eating contest before?
I have not been initiated, but I am you're now my like hook, and I'm totally gonna become a viewer.
Okay. I'm really excited to kind of introduce this bizarre superpower to the world. I don't know,
awesome.
for me,
I can't wait.
Yeah, like I'm super excited. Getting into kind of the origin stories though, some of the allegations against the adoption agencies in how they addressed food and nutrition in the course of our care, it gives me some really mixed emotions because I'm like, is this something that I actually worked for and accomplished for myself, or was this also given to me in some of the more horrible ways? Like, is this actually like a trauma response or a survival instinct that is playing out in this very strange way? So sometimes I think the mystery of the story might actually be kind of the appeal, because I think everybody, no matter if they're adopted or not, at some point, part of the human experience is feeling alone or feeling lost or not knowing what to do with even the positive aspects of yourself. And I think that's something that's rather universal.
Yeah. I think like I've been wondering for a while, like what it is about adoptee stories. Like not even like the superpower Superman, whatever ones. Like even just like when adoptees tell their stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've been wondering for a while, like what accounts for like people's fascination. Like it seems to always touch something in someone, whether that's because they have a personal connection to adoption or because they're just really like there's something about adoption as a practice that taps into perhaps like you're saying like a very human kind of experience. Yeah, I don't know if you've talked about this with other people, but it's interesting like when people say like, oh, I always wish that I was adopted.
Yeah.
And I think the loneliness piece that you mentioned is right, but I think too, it's like I kind of view that statement as a like this imagination of like, well, I truly belong somewhere over there.
Yeah.
Like that's where true belonging is, and I'm upset with my family or my parents right now, and therefore I wish that actually my real parents were over there. Whatever. But yeah, I feel like it taps into this thing around who we are and where we belong and who we came from, and that's something that those questions are universal, like you said. But again, I always like feel like I come back to like, but then what labor does that place on adoptees then, who actually do have living family somewhere else who they don't know, and it's not just an imaginative exercise.
I think that's probably a good place to kind of leave that open-ended question. It's going to kind of leave this conversation as an open question. Yeah, thank you so much.